Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm Jory Sheriff, Senior Manager for Membership Initiatives. If you've ever attended a member program, you know I say this each time, but I really do mean it. Thank you so much for being members and for staying connected to the museum, even when we're not in person. I'm very grateful. We actually tried to do this program a couple weeks ago, but ran into some small technical difficulties. So I appreciate everyone who's joined again today. And for everyone who is new, please allow me to introduce our very special guest, author, historian, and expert in Holocaust restitution cases, Jonathan Petropoulos. Welcome, Jonathan.
Thank you, George.
Jonathan is a John V. Crowell Professor of European History at Claremont McKenna College in Southern California. He received his PhD from Harvard, where he lectured on history and literature. He began working on the subject of Nazi art looting and restitution in 1983. Today, he's here to give us a closer look at his most recent book, Göring's Man in Paris, which is a fascinating account of one of the most notorious art plunderers in history, Dr. Bruno Lohse. In addition, Jonathan is also the author of numerous other books, including Art as Politics in the Third Reich, The Art World in Nazi Germany, Artists Under Hitler, Collaboration and Survival in Nazi Germany, and I will drop those titles into the chat later for your further reading. Jonathan, I also want to say that you come from a family of authors and historians. Your wife, Wendy Lauer, just a couple weeks ago did a great book talk with the museum about her new book, The Ravine, and I'll also put that into the chat for everyone to check out later. So we're so thrilled to welcome you here today.
Oh, thank you, Jory. And I'm glad to be back and talking about Göring's Man in Paris Redux to do it again. I'm so sorry for the technical difficulties before, but I'm confident we have them resolved. So let me share my screen and there's that. And from current slide. Yes, all right, here we go. This is my most recent book. There's actually a story about the cover. I'll just mention it right now. It is the orange-red painting is a Pissarro, a Camille Pissarro that belongs to the Cassirer family. And this is their apartment in Berlin. And the designers at Yale University Press, they chose this image, not knowing that I had a connection to this image. I've helped the Cassirer family for 18 years try to recover this Pissarro. It's in the Thyssen-Bornemisza Museum in Madrid. It is looted as the day is long. No one disputes that it's a looted artwork that's never been restituted, but the Thyssen-Bornemisza, the Republic of Spain, decided they want to keep looted art on their walls. And the case is back with the Supreme Court right now, where we continue to fight. But that's a little bit of the backstory of that image there that the designers came up with. So this is Göring's Man in Paris. His name is Bruno Lohse, and on the left you can see he's in his SS uniform. He clearly was an SS officer all through the Third Reich up until 1945. He lived quite a bit longer. This is Bruno Lohse in 1998 when I first met him. He passed away in 2007, and so I had a chance to talk with him over a 9-year period, and that's one of the foundations for this book. And I just want to mention that towards the end of my talk today, I will discuss, I guess I can say, the practical application of my scholarship. I found it very rewarding that the scholarly work that I do, can be applied to help victims and increasingly heirs recover property. And I was involved with the case that resulted in 5 of the Klimt paintings coming back to the Bloch-Bauer heirs. It was made into a film, Woman in Gold, as many of you know. And yes, that was sort of the start of my consulting work, which has continued for the last 20 years or so. So I wanted to provide some context for this book, for Göring's Man in Paris, and it's part of a series of books that deal with art and culture and art looting in Nazi Germany. The first book, as Jory mentioned in her very gracious introduction, it was my doctoral dissertation. It focused on the Nazi leaders, and that was very common in the 1980s. That's what scholars were doing. They were looking at first-rank individuals. articles. But surprisingly, for me, there was a lacuna in the scholarship, in the scholarly literature. There was no academic book dealing with Nazi art collecting, the Nazi leaders' interest in art at the time. There had been memoirs from monuments officers. There were some journalistic accounts, but nothing really academic. And so I saw an opportunity. And in this book, what I did was for the first half of the book, I documented the Nazi leaders' interest in making cultural policy, overseeing museums, commandeering looting commandos, being players in the looting bureaucracy. But I was really taken with how interested in art and artistic issues the Nazi leaders were. And the second part of the book, I reconstructed collections for about 15 of the Nazi leaders and then analyzed them. Right here, this is Himmler giving Hitler a painting, an Adolf von Menzel painting. And I didn't reconstruct just Hitler's collection, but also the sub-leaders. And Hermann Göring, who was the #2 man in the Third Reich, he had the second largest collection. We now know it numbered about 2,300 pictures, which is almost the size of the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. They have about 2,800 pictures, my understanding is, right? So he had an extraordinary collection. And so what I did was, after reconstructing these collections, I analyzed them and I looked at them in terms of ideology. The slide here for ideology. I looked at it in a more sociological manner. The Nazis use these artworks as stage props, right? They use them instrumentally. This is a garden party of Hermann Göring's, and we see servants in livery and silver cigar cases, and art were part of the props that the Nazi leaders used. They were the new men trying to integrate themselves in the traditional elite, the feudal aristocracy, and artworks and big homes were the stage sets they used. So I talked about how they used the art for sociological purposes and also for anthropological purposes. The Nazis gave one another gifts. There was a culture of gift giving, and art was the favored gift. And one can read a lot into these gifts, right? This is Hitler giving Goering a picture of a falconess, and Goering was the Reich hunting master. He liked to hunt. And so this is a picture of a woman hunting with her falcon, a little, kind of communication from Hitler to Goering in the form of this painting. And so this book took up some big issues about how the Nazi leaders, the most malevolent, barbarous individuals in history, could devote so much time to culture. And I thought that was a philosophical issue worth exploring. On an even broader scale, how the Germans, arguably the most advanced society in the entire world in the 1930s and 40s. They had more Nobel Prizes than any other nation. There were 4 major symphonies in Berlin, one in Auschwitz we see too, right? So this nexus of culture and barbarism that came out in the book. But as I was working on the book and I had academic reviews, I was encouraged to look at second-rank figures who enabled the Nazi leaders to make arts policy and to assemble these large collections. And that became the second book, which really is kind of a precursor to Goering's Man, Faustian Bargain. And on the cover, we have a artist who's making propaganda, his own Faustian bargain, right? Selling his soul to the devil, to the metaphoric devil, for power and riches and what have you. And so this is what I try to do for the various professions that comprise the art world. And just to take one example, Kajetan Muehlmann, the gentleman on the right there, there with Hans Frank, who was the general governor of German-occupied Poland, the general government. Kajetan Muehlmann is the most prolific art plunderer in all of history. He was an Austrian, and he plundered in Vienna in 1938 after the Anschluss. He then went to Poland in 1939 and ravaged the country culturally in 39 and 40. And then he went to the Netherlands, where more Dutch Jews died proportionally than any other country in Western Europe, not the whole of Europe, but Western Europe. And Muehlmann was stealing their cultural property, right? And he continued to function as an art historian, publishing books about Germanic culture. This is one of them, for example. He puts his SS title there on the frontispiece there. And Muehlmann, this is in Poland, he was stealing masterpieces like the Czartoryski Raphael. This picture is still missing, probably the most sought after work from World War II that went missing, that we believe is still in existence. Muehlmann had given it to Hans Frank, who had it at the end of the war, and then it disappeared. But Muehlmann and his commando, they took everything they could, not just masterpieces. This is an example of an apartment in the Netherlands after Mühlmann's commando has been there. And you can see they've taken everything except perhaps the kitchen sink, right? And we have to appreciate that art looting is so inextricably connected to the Holocaust, right? That taking a people's cultural property was a way of dehumanizing them, right? And I think it's an important juncture on the famous phrase is the twisted road to Auschwitz, right? So taking a people's property, putting them in a state of abject poverty, starving them, then they start to, at least in the minds of the Nazis, conform to their racial hierarchies in this way, right? And also the plundering showed that the people doing the persecution, they could profit personally from their involvement. And Mühlmann and Lohse and the others, as we'll see, did profit from being looters in this way. With Muehlmann, and he's seated here in the center here, this is Joseph Goebbels, the Reich propaganda minister. Well, I tracked him everywhere I possibly could. I found an image of him at a Goebbels speech. I documented it and such. But what I ended up with was something like this. This is kind of a metaphor of what I was able to do in Faustian Bargain. This is Kajetan Mühlmann's SS file from the Federal Archives in Berlin. And one can see that it's been damaged by fire. It's been damaged by water. And yet we still have an image of his eyes and his face. Pieces are missing, right? Many pieces are missing, but we get a sense, we get a picture, right? And so I always thought this captured what I was doing with Faustian Bargain, and also in Göring's Man, right? That we get a picture, but there's still pieces of the puzzle that are missing. And I should mention with Faustian Bargain, there's no chapter where I treat an individual that goes more than 32 pages, right? That was all I had back in 2000, right? I used every resource, and I still couldn't develop a fully developed picture of these individuals. And Göring's Man in Paris is distinct. It's different in that way. I would say Göring's Man in Paris is the first time we have this fully developed portrait of an actual Nazi art plunder. Muehlmann, my experience with Muehlmann, though, did lead me to Lohse. I knew that Muehlmann had been captured by the Americans in 1945, that he had cooperated with them in the restitution work, identifying artworks and saying what he knew about the previous owners. I knew that Muehlmann had escaped from American custody. They had put him in the hospital in 1947. The same time, the Poles had demanded his extradition, and the Poles would have been pretty tough with Muehlmann. They very likely would have executed him. And the Americans, I think, had a softness for him. He was charming, he spoke English, and they didn't guard him very carefully, and he went out through the hospital window and was never seen again. And so I tracked him everywhere I could. You can tell I've been doing this for a long time. My hair is darker in this early photo. I had my Nazi hunting Wiesla, my Nazi hunting dog, and one of the things we did was we traipsed through cemeteries trying to figure out when people died, because this was before the internet, and it was really hard to figure out what happened to these individuals. I found Kajetan Mühlmann's grave in Salzburg. He had died, you can't see it, it's here very, very well. In 1958, he had died. But with that information and going to the cemetery records and that, I found his widow, and she lived in this beautiful villa on the Attersee, which is in the Austrian Alps, the Salzkammergut. And she was very gracious. I found her around back there working in the garden, and she said, come on in. And she wouldn't let me take her photo. This is just after she had closed the door. She's actually just closed the left door. It's partially open. I took a photo, but she allowed me to go into the attic. She said, oh yeah, there are photos of my deceased husband up there. And I climbed up there, and sure enough, there were the photos. And he had come back to Austria in the 1950s, even though he was a wanted man. He had been an illegal Nazi in the 1930s, and the Austrians wanted him for being what they called an illegale, an illegal, not so much for being an art plunder, but for being an illegal Nazi. But at least I was able to get some sense of what he did in the 1950s before his death in 1958. In the same region, in the Salzkammergut, shortly thereafter, I went to see Wilhelm Hoettl, who was, as you can read, an SS general. Hoettl worked in Budapest side by side with Adolf Eichmann as they destroyed the Hungarian Jewish community. And Hoettl lived in this town of Altaussee, which was the place where the Nazis had stored many artworks. Hitler had a repository there, a salt mine in Altaussee, and thousands of his artworks were there. And so I went to see Hoettl on a number of occasions in Altaussee. And this is what I started to do in the late 1990s. I realized the old Nazis were still among us, and I decided I would go and interview interview them, right? I had a PhD. They liked the fact that I had attended Harvard, as Jory mentioned, and so I wrote, and I speak German, and I'd go to see them, and oftentimes I'd be very nervous. You notice my hands was shaking here in this image of Hoettl. It's not every day you meet a Nazi criminal like this, and I knew I had a limited opportunity. I tried to make the most of it. And eventually I found my way to Bruno Lohse. And initially we met in beer gardens and restaurants, because I interviewed him a number of times. I'd say over the 9-year period, between 30 and 40 times I interviewed him. Some people would say, well, why'd you talk to him so often, so frequently? And I would respond by saying, a Nazi art plunderer is not going to tell you his secrets on the first visit. You have to develop a relationship. You have to get to know the person. And in my case, Lohse associated me with the monument officers who had interrogated him at war's end, and who he thought had treated him respectfully. And they had all attended Harvard, and he thought of me in that tradition of Harvard gentlemen. And okay, and so he would talk to me. And so I was on a fact-finding mission. I took copious notes after our meetings. He didn't like me taking notes during our meetings. He didn't let me tape record him, but I documented our conversations, and I sent the intelligence I gathered to the appropriate authorities. I sent them to auction houses who were doing provenance research. I sent some reports to the FBI and to Interpol. So I thought of myself as a man on a mission to gather information from one of the key eyewitnesses of what happened in the Nazi plundering bureaucracy. I had mentioned that Göring's Man in Paris is different from Faustian Bargain, also because the archival records also increased in the almost 20 years between the books, right? And I had been agitating for the opening of files. This is my op-ed piece in Art News magazine, where I was saying that researchers needed to get to curatorial files in museums. Museums have archives that are more or less open to researchers. Sometimes there are restrictions, or papers are closed to X date, but their archives are meant for researchers. But there's also records where the curators work in the curatorial departments, and those were not always accessible. So I said, we need more of those, and those are still a struggle to get to. But other archives did open. For example, in France, the archives for the military tribunals, right, of the Justice Militaire open, and they're on an army base near Limoges, in the middle of France. And it's kind of a podunk, if that's a word, archive. It's not a grand archive by any. I was the only person working in there, but it's a gold mine, a treasure trove. And the French Prime Minister opened these at the very end of 2016, basically 2017. And I was one of the first researchers to get there. So there are new materials coming to life. The Swiss Federal Archives in Bern, it's a treasure house, and scholars hadn't fully utilized the archive. So with Lohse, there were a lot of archives besides meeting him that allowed me to write this book, this more fully developed portrait. So who was Dr. Bruno Lohse? He was an art historian, had a PhD in art history. He worked on the German Romantic painter Jakob Philipp Hackert, and he wrote a competent but not really impressive doctoral dissertation. The dissertation was not sufficiently distinguished that it would open up an academic career to him. And so Lohse decided he would try to become an art dealer in the late 1930s. He was operating out of his father's living room in Berlin. His father was very cultured, had been a musician, or was a musician for the Berlin Philharmonic. He was a percussionist. And so the father was supportive of Lohse's efforts, but Lohse was a very minor dealer in the late 1930s. He tried to get in on certain action, selling off the so-called degenerate artworks that had been purged from German state collections. He wrote to Goebbels and the ministry saying, I'd like to sell this art, but really he didn't do much in the late 30s. He had joined the SS. When I asked him why he joined the SS, he said he liked to play sport. He was a very good handball player. It's this European game, and actually his team won the German national championship in 1934 playing for the SS. I suggested there were other ways to play sports besides joining the SS, but but I didn't get much more information from Lohse. Clearly, he was anti-Semitic. Clearly, he believed in the ideology of Himmler and Himmler's elite there. But he was also a very fine athlete. Lohse was 6'4", and when I met him in 1998, he weighed over 350 pounds. He was absolutely massive. But in his prime, he was very fit. Again, he did remain an SS officer in good standing throughout the Third Reich. This is one of his promotions signed by Heinrich Himmler. This is the copy from 1943 where he's being promoted. Again, you can see the fire damage and the water damage. This document's been through a lot. So Lohse had been conscripted into the German army in 1939. He fought in Poland and actually was injured with shrapnel, rather severely injured. He recuperated for about 6 months, and then he rejoined his unit as a driver. And his unit was preparing in 1941 to invade the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa. And Lohse at that time received a telegram from Hermann Göring's office saying Göring needed art dealers, and especially in Western Europe. Was Lohse interested in coming to Paris and being an art dealer for Göring? And so Lohse decided he'd explore the opportunity, and he went to Paris. And he said he didn't like what he found there. He found it objectionable, but he said that he met Göring and that he found a connection with Göring, and that kept him there. Lohse's job was to help Göring amass his great art collection. His main residence was Karenhall near Berlin, and this gives you a sense of what Göring was doing, right? It was a veritable museum, and Göring, one of the sources for his art collection, I mean, he was buying a great deal, but he was also commandeering works from the German looting commandos. And in Paris, the chief looting commando was known as the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, the special task force of Reichsleader Rosenberg. We call it the ERR for short. And Göring would come to the ERR headquarters in the Jeu de Paume Museum, part of the Louvre complex, and Lohse would stage these exhibitions. And they would be the exhibitions of the works stolen from French Jews, and they were presented to Göring for his selection. Göring selected about 750 of these artworks. He said he intended to pay for them. The French had engaged an art historian to value them. They were very low valuations, by the way, but Göring never transferred 1 penny for any of the artworks. But he put them on his trains, or trains plural, and sent them back to Germany, and Lohse assisted him. And you can see there is a kind of connection here with this picture, right? That Lohse was very self-confident. He was brash. He would prepare for these meetings and try to impress Göring, which he did. And the two, they developed, again, a kind of a relationship here. And these are photos that Lohse had in his collection, and he loved these photos, and he'd bring them out every afternoon in his old age and reminisce about the days when he was the king of Paris, right? And you do get a sense of what his war was like. As I said, this is the first time we get this up close and personal look at a plunderer. This is Lohse, in this case in civilian clothes, at a banquet for the ERR. And think about it, there's all this privation, rationing in France, and how are the German looters living? With bottles of wine, with fish, with silver service, with china, right? This was Lohse's war. He had many girlfriends, I guess we would call them, whatever the proper term is, paramours. One, I can identify one of them. It's not this woman, it's another woman. And this woman, we see Lohse seems to be sticking the car antenna into her nose, which may be insight into his personality, into his rather sadistic personality. Here we see another image. I talk about this in the book. It's part of a certain trope of the occupiers taking photos of their romantic conquest. It's a stage photo here. It's rather strange with this colleague on the phone. But what's interesting for me, among other things, is that Lohse is in an SS pullover, right? And he told me, he said, I never wore my SS uniform. Patently not true. He did wear his SS uniform sometime, and this is one example of it. And with Lohse, getting to the bottom of his experiences in Paris, that was one of my projects, right? And among the things that I discovered, it was a lot darker than I had initially believed, right? I found a document a few years back where a German officer, an aristocratic officer in 1952, writes to a French monuments officer and says, I can't believe Lohse's back, free again. When I saw Lohse in 1943, he was boasting of murdering Jews, of killing Jews with his own hands, right? And I don't know if it's true, but I do know that Lohse went on raids with the ERR commandos, and he went into apartments that were still warm, right? Where it means that the residents had just recently been evicted, sent to one of the transit camps like Drancy, and then, presumably onto Auschwitz, where they met a horrible fate. And so he was in the apartments of the victims, right? He saw Jewish individuals who were persecuted. He rescued some Jewish individuals, people who could be useful to him. The Lobel brothers, who were art dealers, Paul Caillou, who was a prominent art dealer, his wife was Jewish, and Lohse actually went to Drancy and got her out of the camp, right? So he rescued a few people, but he did a lot more harm than good. I also think this is an interesting image. Goering and Lohse and the crew there are laughing at the two paintings by Henri Matisse. Goering had progressive taste by Nazi standards. He liked the Impressionist, he liked Van Gogh even, but Matisse was too far, too radical, the colors and the abstract designs. So they were, making fun of this art. What the ERR plunderers did was they put the so-called degenerate art, the abstract works and the works where the colors were not true to nature, in a separate room. They segregated them. And this was fare that Lohse could trade away. He could barter, right? And this was an opportunity for him to embezzle and to enrich himself. And I'll give something away. When Lohse died in 2007, he had 40 pictures in his collection, works by Monet and Renoir and Pissarro and others, valued in the tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars. How did he become so wealthy? Well, my argument is that there's a wartime origin to his wealth, right? He was able to hide away works, and the works that were easiest to commandeer, where graft was the greatest possibility, are the modern works that the Nazis didn't want to have come back into Germany, right? So I just, part of the book, takes you there into the life of existence of a plunderer, what it's like. And sometimes it's just the little detail, like you see a photo of painting stacked, and you start to get a sense of what 20 or 30,000 paintings looks like when they steal them. And the ER stole about 30,000 artworks from French Jews. That was the number. Now, I also talk about Lohse's nemesis in Paris, Rose Valland, who many of you will have heard of. She's a figure in the film, the not very good film, Monuments Men, the Kate Blanchett character. She actually spits into a champagne glass in the opening scene that goes to Goering and Lohse. She went on to become a monuments officer. I should say she stayed in the Jeu de Paume facility. She pretended she did not speak German, even though she did. She took incredible notes on what was happening there and conveyed the information to the leadership of the French National Museums. She was a member of the French Resistance. She helped prevent a train filled with artworks from going to Germany at war's end. She was a true hero. And then she went on to become the most important monuments officer of all World War II and post-World War II. I hate the term monuments men. There were monuments women there, and she was incredibly important for the next 30 years. She tried to repair the damage that was done by Lohse and company. She's a hero in France. There's postage stamps with her image on it. There's even a graphic portrayal of her exploits. It always kind of tickles me, if you will, to see Goering and Lohse in cartoon form here, right? But that's part of the story here. And one other, I would call a fascinating fact, besides the Lohse being in a graphic portrayal, probably my favorite artist is the German painter Max Beckmann, who had these very difficult allegories, oftentimes exploring the themes of culture and barbarism. And in one of his paintings from 1943, he depicted Lohse. Lohse is here. He's a croupier. This is a painting called Dream of Monte Carlo. And there are two croupiers who are both art plunderers. This is Erhard Goeppel, who was a plunderer plunderer for Hitler, and Lohse, the rival, who was a plunderer primarily for Göring. And Goebbels was one of Max Beckmann's closest friends. Goebbels brought him food, bought him paints, delivered letters for him when Beckmann was in Amsterdam from 1937 until 1947. And Goebbels was a friend, and Goebbels told him about Lohse. And so we have this whole painting that we've been able to explicate. This is Pierre Bonny, who was head of the French Gestapo, and Lohse used these collaborators. He was a gangster and worked for the German occupiers, and so we can explicate. Pierre Bonny would use a mallet to torture people and beat the people he was interrogating, and so Beckmann got that in his picture. But I think it's sort of extraordinary that Lohse is captured by Beckmann. It's a painting that's in the Stuttgart Staatsgalerie today, right? So at war's end, Lohse had left Paris and he had gone back to Germany, and he decided he would try and help safeguard the ERR plunder that was stored at Neuschwanstein, the castle in the south of Germany, right? The Disneyland castle, if you will. And Neuschwanstein had, at this repository, there were about 22,000 cultural objects stolen by the ERR. There were about 10,000 other ERR repositories. There was also the card catalog. This was a record of the previous owners of the artworks, right, where they had been taken from. It was crucial for restitution. And there were SS troops in the area of Neuschwanstein who wanted to destroy not just the card catalog, they wanted to destroy the castle and its entire contents. They believed that this should not fall into enemy hands, into Allied hands, and they were so radical they wanted to destroy all of this. This was not Hitler's orders. This is rogue SS who want to do this. And Lohse, with his SS affiliation, he talked them down. He said, no, you can't do this. There's no orders from Himmler. There's no orders from Hitler. And he does deserve some credit, especially for saving the card catalog, where they really wanted to destroy it. At war's end, Lohse was sitting on the wall right back here. This is an old cloister turned into a nursing home, and he was holding a book, a French book about Joan of Arc, trying to appear cultured and whatever. Lohse spoke perfect French, by the way, and that made him a more effective plunderer in Paris. He was arrested by this individual, James Rorimer, who was one of the most famous monuments officers. And Rorimer went on to become the director of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the first Jewish director of the Met from, as you can see, 1955 to 1966, right? And this is going to be significant in a certain way. Rorimer kept his distance from Lohse, but the same cannot be said for all monuments officers and all Met employees, as we'll see. At war's end, Lohse and the other top Nazi art plunderers were brought to this house in the Austrian Alps near Altaussee, again, and they were interrogated in the summer of 1945 for about 3 months. And one of those who interrogated Lohse was this gentleman, Theodore Ted Rousseau. He was part of the Office of Strategic Services Art Looting Investigation Unit. And they tried to also get to the bottom of what Lohse had done during the war. They weren't quite sure how nefarious, how destructive Lohse was. They needed more information, was their conclusion. With other art plunderers, they say, treat them as war criminals, prosecute them. But with Lohse, he had charmed them. There was, again, some kind of connection there. And they said, let's hand him over to the French. Well, let's first send him to Nuremberg and testify, and then we'll hand him over to the French. And they did hand him over to the French in 1946. Lohse did testify at Nuremberg, and then Lohse himself was put on trial in 1950 before one of these military tribunals. And Roosevelt came back and tried to help with the prosecution and show, that Lohse had not just stolen, but embezzled and enriched himself. But she couldn't quite make the case, right? There was still a dearth of information at that time. And also in 1950, the French were getting tired of these tribunals and post-war justice. The myth of the French resistance had taken hold, right? And everyone was in the resistance and they'd all fought the good fight, and they didn't want to deal with this ugly collaborationist past was really, and so for various reasons, they acquitted Lohse, right? This is the document that Lohse kept in his papers when he died in 2007. I inherited some of his papers and some of his photographs, and he was very proud that he was acquitted because it allowed him to go into business, right? And he printed up a card and he said, I'm an art historian, Kunsthistoriker, but he was an art dealer. He ended up living, and he moved in the later 1950s to this apartment in Munich. He had relocated from Berlin to Munich. Berlin was so bomb damaged and it was surrounded by what it became East Germany, right, by a communist state, and wasn't a good place to apply the art trade. So he went to Munich, the capital of the German art market, and he lived, I would say, rather modestly considering how wealthy he really was. He had the top floor of this apartment building, and eventually I was let in, and I remember walking in the first time, and one room had German expressionist works, right, a big landscape by Emil Nolde, some watercolors by Gabriele Munter and Mariana Werfgen, very sublime, beautiful art. And another room had Dutch old masters and that too. So a lot of very valuable art in this apartment and the top floor. Clearly, Lohse was active in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000 for 40 years. And we just get little glimpses of him, right? A document from the Bavarian state painting collections, they say there's a Murillo being offered. He's an intermediary here, right, for 1.5 million Deutschmarks. This is in the mid-1960s. But what I try to show is that it wasn't just Lohse who was in the art world and the art trade. It was his whole cohort, right? These Nazi art plunderers. And just to give one brief example, Walter Andreas Hofer had been the director of Goering's collection. Lohse was merely an agent, granted the agent in Paris, the most important market, but this was Hofer's was the position Lohse really wanted to have, right? They were great rivals, and Lohse was hated Hofer and wanted his job. And Hofer, after the war, he's doing business again. This is from the German art magazine Die Weltkunst, right? And 1966, and Walter Andreas Hofer, Goering's, art director there, is back in business. Hofer lived in this apartment, a beautiful apartment right on the English Garden in Munich, and right below him, Hofer lived in the top floor, and right below him lived this fellow, Karl Haberstock. Haberstock had been the most important art dealer in Germany during the Third Reich. It had a grand gallery in Berlin that was bombed and such. And so Haberstock had also obviously moved to Munich, and he was plying his trade out of his apartment there. Haberstock made a tremendous amount of money selling works to Hitler and Göring and Speer and Goebbels. And with the profits he made, he had collected art himself, and he donated much of his own art to the municipal museum in his hometown of Augsburg, right? The Schutzler Palais. And there was when I went in for the first time in the 1990s, there was a big bust of Haberstock as he went in. There still is to this day a street nearby named after him. He's an honorary citizen of Augsburg. He was a terrible Nazi dealer who plundered himself. And so it was Haberstock and Hofer and Lohse. You may have heard of the Görlitz, right? That a few years ago, a cache of over 1,600 artworks was found in Munich, belonging to the son of Hildebrand Görlitz, who had been part of that cohort. Hildebrand Görlitz had died in 1956, so he wasn't part of the scene for the whole post-war period, but his son had the collection and would sell off the odd piece to support himself. And at the time of the disclosure of the revelation, there were reports that the collection was worth over $1 billion. I think that's rather high, but it's a very fine collection. But the point is, and what I document in the book, is that there are these networks of these Nazi dealers, right? And for me, what I found is that not for me, but I maintained that the network is like a series of concentric circles that spread outwards like a drop in a lake or there. And the heart of the network is in Munich, where there were many old Nazis like Lohse. But then there's the golden quadrangle that surrounds it, and that includes Austria, where they didn't do a very good job of mastering their past for many years after the war, right? They elected Kurt Waldheim as president in the 1980s. They had problems with the Nazi past. There was Switzerland, with a culture of banking secrecy Altaussee that's so important for what the Nazis did with their assets. And there's Liechtenstein, right, as part of it too, which is a land of foundations and tax havens too. And so between Bavaria, Austria, Switzerland, Liechtenstein, that was the core of the network there, right? But the network expands outward, right? It does. And here's a list of wanted war criminals who should not have been able to come into the United States. And Bruno Lohse is on this list here, right here. And you can see Bruno Lohse, doctor, chief assistant of Rosenberg's looting office. They didn't have computers then. They didn't keep track of who was coming in and out of the country very well. Yes, there were visas, but you could circumvent them. And one of the first things Lohse did when he got out of prison in 1950 is he came to North America. He actually didn't come to the United States the first trip. He went to Canada, but he went through LaGuardia and he tried to pass off photographs in LaGuardia for this individual, Ted Rousseau, the OSS officer who would become a curator at the Met. And Rousseau rose to the position of chief curator for European paintings and deputy director of the Met under Tom Hoven, right? So very important person at the Met. And one of the things I found in my research is that the Rousseau-Lohse correspondence survived. You know, Rousseau held on to it. And those were recently cataloged and made accessible. And there are dozens and dozens of letters. Rousseau would go to Europe every summer to go on buying trips, right, to acquire works for the museum. And he would invariably write to Lohse and say, I want to meet with you. You know, when are you available? And Lohse would write back and offer works. And he was offering wonderful works to Rousseau when they met. He offered works by Cezanne, by Van Gogh, by Botticelli. Now, I can't find any evidence of the Met buying directly from Lohse, but again, you see this relationship that's so casual, so personal, right? You know, Lohse dropping by the Met. I'm here, and Rousseau's meeting Lohse not just in Munich, but they're meeting in Zurich, they're meeting in Paris. There's every indication that there's a business connection. Rousseau was a risk taker, right? I call him a swashbuckling curator. He had been a spy. He was a ladies' man, had a lot of affairs with married women, some famous married women. And so he was a daredevil, right? And I think meeting with an old Nazi art plunderer who knew information, who knew where the bodies were buried, that was part of the way he operated. Rousseau would circumnavigate export laws, the French export laws, for example. So he played it close to the edge there. And I think meeting with Lohse was part of that. Of course, Rousseau knew who Lohse was, and he knew about the issue of Nazi art plundering. This is the cover of the New York Times in 1964. You cannot say no one knew about Nazi art plundering. It's just a ridiculous thing to say. There were films like The Train with Burt Lancaster in 1964. Later on, there's films like Indiana Jones. Those are about Nazis stealing cultural property. The Ark of the Covenant is cultural property. People know the Nazis stole art. Rousseau knew better than ever, but he still couldn't resist seeing Lohse. And Lohse, he revived his career, and he played the role of the suave, sophisticated, powerful German dealer, right? He'd come to New York, he'd stay in the most beautiful hotels, he'd have fancy cars, and this was what happened there, right? Well, the story takes us in other directions too, including the story of this Pissarro. It had belonged to the Fisher family. And the Fishers were the great publishing dynasty. Samuel Fisher, who had published Sigmund Freud and Thomas Mann and others. And the family had moved from Germany to Austria. They were in Vienna, but they were overrun in 1938 with the Anschluss, and this picture was taken from them. And it was first sold in Vienna as a picture by Paul Emile Pissarro, the son of Camille Pissarro. It wasn't. That was also graphed, because Paul Emile Pissarro's works wouldn't fetch the same high prices. So someone put a false attribution, bought it inexpensively, flipped it, and it was sold in Berlin in 1943 for 95,000 Reichsmarks, which is a lot of money. The average worker earned 2,500 Reichsmarks per year. So this is a lot of money. But then it disappeared. We don't know what happened. But in 2000, someone from the Art Loss Register came to me and said, we believe that Lohse has something to do with this picture. It was exhibited in 1984 in Switzerland, in Lausanne, and the lender was this Fondation Bruno, the Bruno Foundation. Could you go and ask Lohse about this picture? So I did. And at all of our meetings, this gentleman on the right was present, Peter Griebert. And Peter Griebert is also an art dealer. He's still alive. And he had known Lohse since Griebert was a child. And they were friends, close friends. Griebert took care of Lohse's business when Lohse got older. I think they were sometimes partners in the art trade. And eventually Griebert, I asked Lohse about this Pissarro for 6 years straight. And every time I saw him, I asked him about the Pissarro, and he said, are you going to ask me about the damn Pissarro picture? That's verdammte Pissarro build. I said, yeah, do you know anything about it? Because I thought he did. And finally, Griebert in 2006 produced this document. He said to me, he said, I see Lohse was lying. And I know it's in German, but basically in 1957, this gentleman, Friedrich Schöni, who is a Swiss lawyer, writes to Lohse and confirms that he's bought it for the picture for $10,000, and Lohse gets a commission of $1,500. So that's what I believed, was that Lohse had lied to me that he had sold it in 1957, but it turned out to be a more complex story than that. I was able to inspect the painting in Zurich. Griebert and I met at a cafe, and then he walked me down the street to the Zurich Cantonal Bank on the Bahnhofstrasse. They say there's more wealth below ground there on the Bahnhofstrasse than there is in any other European city. This is where all the banks are. And we examined the picture and made sure it was the right picture. And there's a long saga. Read the book and get the full story. But it took us to Liechtenstein. Griebert told me that the picture belonged to the children of Friedrich Schöni, and that I was going to meet with their representatives. And I did meet with these representatives, supposedly of the children of Friedrich Schöni. But it turns out Friedrich Schöni didn't have children. There was a foundation called Schönart, and I always thought it was Friedrich Schöni's name with art, but it turned out Friedrich Schöni had created a foundation for Bruno Lohse, and Lohse owned the foundation. I didn't know that. That only came out after Lohse died in March 2007. Also, the bank vault was open, and they found their 14 works that were there in the bank vault there too. This picture was restituted to the Fischer family, and they decided to sell it, and there's a story there. What this picture is also important about is, one of the big takeaways from the book, and I won't go into great detail here because I know I've gone a little long, but Schöni turned out to have been the lawyer for the Wildensteins, and the Wildensteins are the greatest art dealers in the second half of the 20th century. I give that distinction to the Duvines for the first half of the 20th, but the Wildensteins, they've been the subject of controversy with plastic surgery that maybe didn't work out so well, and expensive divorces. They're very secretive. They keep incredible quantities of art in their repositories in Paris and New York and in Kenya. But the evidence is indisputable. Friedrich Schöni, he was shipping industrial quantities of art for the Wildensteins to the United States in the 1950s, right? This is a document from Switzerland. Who's sending it? Friedrich Schöni. Friedrich Schöni, again, was Lohse's partner. He was his lawyer. He was his banker. He was his key person. So Lohse was in the Wildenstein orbit, and that's something I think is worth talking about. The Wildensteins are Jewish. They were plundered by the ERR before Lohse got there, but Lohse helped dispose of their work. And this is a letter from one of the members of the family, Alec Wildenstein, who's died. But at this point, when Lohse had passed away, Alec said he had known Lohse for 60 years. So we need, that's a big point. The most important art dealers who are Jewish are in this network of old Nazi dealers. Now with Lohse, we know that he was selling works to museums. These two pictures by Dürer, or the workshop of Dürer, there's a dispute, went to the German Historical Museum. When I wrote to them and said, you bought a picture by Bruno Lohse, from Bruno Lohse, they said, no, we didn't. And I said, well, he might have used the name Peter Griebert as the seller. That's a cutout, as an intermediary. And they said, yeah, Peter Griebert sold it to us. And they did let me in to see some of the documentation. They didn't show me all the documentation. It turned out Lohse had put these two Kaiser pictures, as they call them, up for sale in the 1960s with Wildenstein in New York. Another linkage between Wildenstein and Lohse. It didn't sell at that point, but the German Historical Museum didn't show me that document, that contract, but it came out later, and we were able to find it. So this is the story of Lohse, right? Who I think the book is important, if we can say that, not just for what it tells you about the war, but about the post-war period, what happened to these art plunderers and how they, integrated into the respectable art trade. And again, there are people who sometimes didn't fully appreciate who Lohse was, or Grieber, his role in all this, but it's part of the story, and we need to tell that story in the post-war period. And Lohse took many secrets with him to his grave. He's buried in a beautiful cemetery in Munich. It's considered a real honor to be in this Bogenhausen cemetery. There are artists and writers and intellectuals there. And so Lohse got away with something again in terms of his last resting place. And so I know that I'm a little bit long here, 149, and I won't say too much about the practical application, or maybe I'll just do in 2 minutes. I'll tell you 3 minutes, very quickly. I guess my real first practical application was working for this Presidential Commission on Holocaust Assets in the U.S. And one of our cases involved the Hungarian gold train that Hoettl, I mentioned earlier, had helped steal valuables from Hungarian Jews, and they put them on the train, and they were trying to get to Switzerland with their loot, right? But the Americans intercepted this train, and Americans in this instance didn't do the right thing. Our policy was to return cultural property to the government of the country of origin. We should have sent this back to Hungary. Hungary was going communist, and there was a reason we didn't want to send it back there, but we didn't follow our procedures. We sent back over 500,000 objects to the Soviet Union, to a communist state. We shouldn't have sent them back to. So I was involved with this case. It resulted in a class action settlement. About $25 million was sent to the Hungarian Jewish community to take care of the elderly and provide with health care and that. And that led to the Woman in Gold case and all these beautiful clips. I can't talk about everyone. If you watch the film, you think there's only one picture, but there's others. I mean, for example, this beautiful portrait of Adela was bought by Oprah Winfrey in 2006 for $70 million. She sold it a couple of years ago to a Chinese businessman for $150 million. She's a very good businesswoman herself. So there's a story with each picture. This is the same lake where Kajetan Muehlmann's widow lived, on the Attersee, right? That Klimt went out in a rowboat and would paint the shoreline from his boat there. So wonderful pictures. And I won't go into detail. It's a will, and there's the Anschluss, and the palace it was taken from, and the seizure order, and it went to the Austrian National Gallery, and they kept it there in bad faith until Randy Schoenberg, here in Los Angeles, a very talented lawyer, took the case, found jurisdiction in America. It went all the way to the Supreme Court to have this happen. They ended up going into binding arbitration in Vienna, and 5 of the 6 works came back, including the Golden Adela. People were happy. I thought all 6 paintings should have come back, not just 5. I think all 6 could have, but that's another story. Ronald Lauder bought the Golden Adela then for it was $135 million, then the most expensive picture in the world. It's been superseded since then. It's his Mona Lisa in the Neue Gallery in New York. And at that point, people were so optimistic about the work of restitution. It was a time for real celebration. Lawyers got interested because the sums were considerable. The 5 paintings had sold collectively for $330 million. This is the wholesale, but and at that point in 2006, museums seemed much more cooperative, and they were negotiating settlements. These are 2 settlements that were concluded with the heirs of Paul von Mendelssohn Bartholdy. But then things started to change after that, especially with the realization that these works were so valuable. This was a case involving works by George Gross that George Gross' children claimed had been stolen from him. And the Museum of Modern Art, MoMA, won that case based on the statute of limitations. So the heirs never had a day in court. Well, they did, and it was thrown out on statute of limitations. This is the Chronics of Norton Simon. Also, on a very technical ground, it was dismissed, the case. This is the Cassiers, the Thyssen-Born and Mietze picture I told you about. They lost on choice of law. The judge applied Spanish law. And there's a law professor, Jennifer Crater, who's made a chart that goes on, and all these cases that have been decided by technical defenses, right? Statute of limitations, laches, choice of law, and it was pretty depressing, right? If I had a batting average in the case I've been involved with, I would not be in the major leagues, right? I've lost most of the cases on technical defenses. There was some effort to remedy this. The Holocaust Expropriated Art Recovery Act, kind of funny, they had Helen Mirren testifying because she had played Maria Altman, the Black Power era in the film. Okay, star power, it helped, it passed, and it's made a difference, right? There's some cases that have come up where the HERE Act has really made a difference, such as the Sheilas. There was a very similar fact set earlier in 2007, 2008, and the heirs lost, but on the grounds of laches. In this case, with the HERE Act, they won it, and they won an appeal. There have been some other successes. This Picasso Blue Period pastel was given back recently by the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. So I guess I would conclude with referring to the great Stuart Eisenstadt and his title Imperfect Justice, right? That's what we're dealing with here. You know, I continue to fight what I think is a good fight and try and help victims and heirs recover. We have some successes, but there's so much where we're frustrated, right? The Swiss bank vaults are still filled with looted property. The customs-free, the duty-free areas in Switzerland still have looted cultural property. Latin America, Russia, there's all these places where there's work to be done. And I guess I would conclude with this quotation from Robert Bergman, right? And I sympathize with him. I believe that for the rest of my professional career, this issue will face the museums of the world. And you know, I for one plan to work for restitution the rest of my career. So thank you for your attention, and yeah, I'm happy to answer some questions.
Please. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you so much. That was so fascinating. And the photos added such an incredible dimension to this story. It's really kind of unbelievable. There are a lot of questions, as I'm sure you can imagine, but actually before I was going to ask a broader question, but since everyone seems to be asking the same thing, I'll just start off with how in the world did Lohse get acquitted? In your opinion? I know it's a long answer probably, but.
Yeah, it's a good question. His line at the time was that he was just an art historian, and he was cataloging the objects that came into the facility, into the Jeu de Paume, the ERR headquarters. And he said, yeah, we had a library, and of course the library was comprised of looted books, you know, things the ERR had stolen, and we would research the works that came through. So I was a simple art historian doing cataloging work, and you cannot prove that I, you know, profited personally. You cannot find any artwork that I stole personally, even though Rose Valland in her notations would say, Lohse walked out with 4 paintings a day, or, you know, Lohse has furnished his apartment on the, just off the what do you call it, the Champs-Elysees. He had an apartment right there. He could walk to the Jeu de Paume, and, you know, she chronicled, he took carpets, and there's wartime notations, but to find the objects, right, and prove the case that he actually embezzled, she wasn't able to do it. And you know, he also claimed that he was not formally attached to the ERR. In fact, he had become the deputy director, or the co-director in 1943. For 1 year, he was the director of it, but he maintained that, you know, prove that I was a member of this. And it was very difficult to prove for some strange reason. And so he had just enough of an element of doubt in there. And it's still a shocking decision, right? And I went to my colleague, my friend Jean-Marc Dreyfus, and who's a French scholar of looting and restitution. I said, Jean-Marc, what do you think happened? And he's the one who said, oh no, it was really part of a bigger picture issue. If Lohse had been tried in 1946, 47, he certainly would have been found guilty. But by 1950, you know, it's the myth of the French resistance that I mentioned before. That's completely from Jean-Marc, that point, that, you know, the French were tired of putting people on trial. They had been through their épuration sauvage, the brutal immediate justice, shaving women's heads who had been involved in collaboration and sometimes worse. They had been through the épuration légale, the denazification of the French. And they were just they wanted to get back to their lives, and so there was a lack of will. But it's something I should say that really upset Rose Valland, and she took it personally because she had been there for the interrogations, and she was trying to get Lohse, and thereafter she dedicated herself to researching Lohse, and Lohse took it personally too. He said, oh no, he always called her horrible and ugly, and he's actually said something to me that I found really insane. He said, oh, Rose Valland had always wanted me romantically, and I had rejected her, and she was always mad at me. And Rose Valland was openly gay. Even in the graphic portrayal that I showed you, there's scenes with her spouse, right, her partner, and Rose Valland was never interested in men, so it's a completely ridiculous assertion. But they continued their rivalry into the post-war period, and Rose Valland, who died in the early 80s, she was never able to get Lohse, and I feel myself very much following in her footsteps. Like, I'm hoping with my book, my portrayal, that I was able to fill in the gaps and show his complicity and his guilt in a way that she wasn't quite able to.
Absolutely. Yeah. As a museum worker who happens to work in a Holocaust museum, I find Rousseau's relationship with Lohse, specifically asking him for art acquisitions, to be so fascinating and complicated. Just what do you think about Lohse's social mobility after the war? And he was able to cultivate all of these important relationships with prominent cultural figures. What do you make of this?
Well, he was very charming. He was simultaneously, for me, terrifying and charming. Of course, I had a better sense. Well, actually, when I met him in 1998, I didn't really appreciate the harm he had done, but I could still feel the, for lack of a better word, the evil that was present there. And whenever I would see him, I would wake up early that morning, sometimes in a little bit of a cold sweat. That feeling like something was going to happen that day, and I'd go see him, and then he would be so kind of relaxed and charming. He had a sense of humor. He was a Berliner, and he had this kind of dark sense of humor. I mean, a couple of quotes from, or at least one quote from Lohse. He said, "I'm against any corruption," and he pauses, "that I'm not involved in." Right, and so he kind of had this black sense of humor, and he would charm, and he would, and I kept on mission. I always, I'm here to be a fact finder. I'm not here to be friends with him. I'm here to get information out of him, and so it's a good question how he was able to do it. He had these bright blue eyes that were, and he had this real charisma that was there, and he worked hard at these relationships. You can see with the correspondence he would keep up. I passed letters back and forth between two other of the OSS officers who interrogated Lohse. One was S. Lane Faison, who taught at Williams College and was a legendary professor of art history and taught all these great art historians who went on to become museum directors. And actually, one of the things I have that I'm in my office here, I'm going to grab it, show and tell. Sorry, I probably shouldn't run away, but this is something I treasure here. It's from Lane Faison, and it's his report, his OSS report on Hitler's museum, and he wrote it in 2002. He says, "To Jonathan Petropoulos, who will bring to conclusion what the contents here started, Lane Faison," right? So I've always felt myself kind of the next generation of monuments officer after Rousseau, Faison, and Plaut, but it was always interesting that they kept in touch with Lohse, and Faison would take his students from William College to Munich, and Lohse would speak to them, which it's amazing to me, and I don't fully understand it exactly. I mean, I know why I was seeing Lohse, because I was trying to write this book and trying to resolve these cases, but it's a good question. They had a wartime bond. They spent 3 months together in the Austrian Alps. They had these adventures in the post-war period. I mean, I know why Lohse wanted to have good relations with the Americans, because the respect they showed him and the opportunities to do business. In the case of Rousseau, those were clear motivating factors. And I can see why Rousseau wanted Lohse, because as a source of information, maybe as a source of art, but it's still, not that I'm still trying to untie. It's really, it's a good question.
I mean, in your search for simply just the facts, I was thinking about this idea of Lohse as an unreliable narrator. I mean, you mentioned, he said he didn't wear his SS uniform, but clearly photos show that he did. There are more examples of this. I guess as a researcher, how did you navigate Lohse's sort of deceptive qualities?
Yeah, well, I always assumed that he was lying to me, and I try to be transparent when I utilized his information. For example, I did use him for Faustian Bargain. That was, we had an understanding initially. He didn't want to talk about himself and say very much about his experiences, but he would talk about the others I was writing about. So he told me a lot about Karl Haberstock and Haberstock's wife Magdalena, and he told me about Walter Andreas Hofer, and he told me about Muehlmann. And so that was the foundation. He said, I don't want to tell you about my life and that, but eventually we moved to his life. And there were times where he would just refuse to answer a question. So I'd say, well, who are your clients? Because he'd say, I'm an art advisor. Ich bin Kunstberater. And I said, who are your clients? And he said, I won't tell you. And I said, can I guess? Will you if I say this person and that person? And so sometimes he would just say, no, that's off limits. And other times I kind of had a sense he was lying. I didn't believe him, but I would say, really, I don't believe it. We would be very direct with one another, but he said, yes, this is what I'm stating now. But that being said, he lied to me at times, and I did believe the lies, and I was misled. And it wasn't just he who lied, but it was Peter Griebert, right? And so when Griebert came to me with a story that the Fischer Pissarro was owned by Frederick Schuny, and there was a foundation of his children, and that, I believed that for a while too, right? So I can't say that I was able to detect all the lies, but I went in with the assumption that lies were mixed in, and whenever I did use Lohse as the sole source, I did a couple of places in Faustian Bargain, I just qualified it. This is according to Lohse, and he may not be telling the truth. So I tried to be transparent and let the reader know that I couldn't be certain there. But it's a good question. And, we weren't taught in history graduate school, what do you do when you're interviewing liars? Like,
Interviewing a Nazi.
A lying Nazi, that may be redundant there. Yeah, it was a challenge, and you try to triangulate and get information from different parties and that. But you just go into, with Lohse, it's almost like the Muehlmann photo I had where the pieces of the puzzle are still missing, right? You go into the enterprise of writing about Lohse knowing there's things that you'll never discover that are going to be, and that's, he wanted to conceal them. That's what he was doing. Actually, one of the interesting points, I went back to Griebert after Lohse died and stuff came out, and I challenged it. I said, well, you lied about Frederick Schumann and the children. He says, well, you put so much pressure on Lohse. Lohse said, give the damn picture back to get back, do it through Jonathan, Uber Jonathan. And Griebert said, well, for my part, I want 10% of the market value. And Lohse said, fine, take that. I didn't know any of this, right? And so Lohse said, make up a story and make it stick. And so they made up the story together about Frederick Schumann and the children. And and I asked Griebert later. He said, well, it was the best way to get it back. We were trying to give the painting back, and that. So you go into the enterprise knowing there's things you're not gonna have the full picture. I would even mention that I've been helping make a documentary film based on the book, and the filmmaking team is really outstanding. Hugo McGregor in London and his team, and even since I finished the book about 8 months ago, the team has been finding things about Lohse that I hadn't known about. It all confirms what I've been saying, but we found, for example, that Lohse sold a work to the Kunsthaus in Zurich in 2006, I think it is, and I hadn't known about that. And we found, we've been finding little bits about how it's all consistent with what he did. It just shows actually he had more art than the 40 pictures that we documented, if anything. But the point was, Lohse was trying to conceal things. Actually, and one of the point I wanted to make with Griebert, when I asked him for an account of what he had done, why he had lied to me, and he said, one of the things he says, well, it was easy to do because Bruno Lohse never kept records. The only time he made a receipt, such as 1957, was to deceive. right? Other than that, he like handshake deals. He had a very romantic conception of the art trade, that there was honor and handshake deals, and that's how you did your transactions. And he only created a document when he was trying to deceive. So not only did he conceal, he took steps to intentionally deceive researchers who would come along. And I saw it in action with that 1957 document.
Answer a couple questions from
Yeah.
members. Sort of related to this, sometimes you go to the families to sort of corroborate a story. Was Lohse married? Did he have a family?
So Lohse was married, and his wife was named Illy, they called her. She's actually in this slide here. They're buried together. Oops, sorry, I'll go back there. And she predeceased him. So she died in 1979. See, Ilse, but they call her Illy. And one thing that was interesting, when he died, his foundation, the Schoenart Foundation, had a provision that it morphed into something called the Illy Foundation. And then it had a provision, it morphed one more time into another foundation. So I got to see how Liechtenstein works. It's a crazy world there with all these foundations and that, but they didn't have any children. She evidently was unable to have children. And so Lohse has nieces and nephews, and they were the primary beneficiaries of his estate. Lohse was one of those people who liked to manipulate his will, and he would change it regularly depending on whether people were in good favor or not good favor, right? And he'd take people out of the will. One of the other beneficiaries, I'm understand, was Ada Göring, the daughter of Hermann Göring. Lohse remained devoted to not just Göring, but in Göring's memory, but the daughter, and she supposedly received a picture. She subsequently passed away too. But it's the nieces and nephews who recovered the estate. And it is notable that of all the works they recovered, none of them were restituted except the Fischer Pissarro. And we know some of the other works were looted. There's a Dutch old master by Jan Meerhout that belonged to the Jaffe family and was stolen by Kajetan Muehlmann and his operations in the Netherlands. And it's indisputably looted and never restituted. And initially, the Lohse heirs, the niece and nephew indicated they would return it, but that has not happened. They refused. I was told when they found out how much it was worth, they decided to keep it. And so the restitution work has been really disappointing in that way. And I've been contacted by auction houses for a couple pictures, a Renoir that I didn't know about it, and a Manet I didn't know about, and they were Lohse pictures that have been put up by some of the heirs too. So those are hitting the market now. It's very disappointing and sad. Some of them are looted and they haven't been restituted, but I'm not sure what I can do there, except call it out and say, be careful. If you see a Jan Meerhout on the market, be very careful. If you're buying art, do your provenance research there, because Lohse's, it's a sad story that he was able to rehabilitate his career after the war and become fabulously wealthy, and also that his collection was largely not restituted, and it's still part of the unfinished business of World War II.
Yeah, I think a lot of members are really interested in this idea of justice. And so I think that aspect of this story is just very frustrating, because there are so many scholars like you and lawyers who are very invested. And this is Holocaust restitution in particular is, as you know, such an emotionally charged topic. Before we sign off, I just would love to hear what initially drew you to the topic of Holocaust restitution, and how do you feel?
Oh, that's a great question. Thank you. Well, for me, World War II was always seemed the central event of the 20th century, of the modern era. My father was born in Athens in 1930, and so he was 11 years old when the Germans rolled into Greece, and he endured the German occupation. And I was raised with stories of privation. My grandmother my yaya was a magician in the kitchen, and she could feed the whole family with a sack of black-eyed peas for a month, and she'd make stews and breads and that. And they had some Jewish friends that they helped save. They got out of Greece through Patras to Egypt, and then Palestine. So I remember hearing these stories about the war, and so I guess I stumbled into the topic when I started graduate school, and I found it resonated with me personally because my family history. It resonated with me philosophically, as I mentioned earlier. This interest about this nexus of culture and barbarism. I thought that was really interesting, and I started to read the work of George Steiner, the great literary critic, and he talked about how intellectuals not only failed to prevent the Holocaust, but in many ways contributed to it. Right? They were the schemers and the planners and the facilitators, and I became interested in those big George Steinerist issues there. And then finally, the practical element too. I mean, it's so rewarding to me to be able to use my scholarship and help families recover this property. I've never worked against a restitution case. I've never worked for a museum and said, no, I'm going to prevent restitution. I've always been on the side of the families. And I think there's an ethical component to my work. And yes, I mean, I've been criticized. People said, oh, you shouldn't have talked to Lohse so often. But as I explained earlier, it was in the service of recovery, of repair, and so I mean I do feel like I'm fighting the good fight. And I wrote one book on a non-looted art topic. I wrote a book about German princes in the Third Reich called Royals in the Reich, and I really enjoyed the project. But it's almost that the subject of Nazi art, loot, and restitution grabbed a hold of me, and I've given in now. And it's like, all right, for the rest of my I'm going to do Nazi looted art. It's my calling. So hopefully that answers the question.
It's a worthwhile cause, and I'm so grateful for all your scholarship. I won't keep anyone too long, but I just wanted to say, Jonathan, thank you so much for joining us today, for your scholarship and your research. We're so grateful. We will follow up with all of you tomorrow for a recording of this program and additional resources for your further reading. Thank you so much for being members. We're so grateful for your support. And Jonathan, hopefully we'll see you again soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jory. Appreciate it.